What happens when the problem of government collides with the problem of money? Welcome to Bonkers Economics, and this, which is episode 4 of our series Fixing Our Economy. And we're going to be looking here at what happens when money and government don't match up, when there's a mismatch between how those things function. So in our episode 2, we looked at the problem of money. In episode 3, we looked at the problem of government, and now we're going to put those two together and see if we can make things work a bit better than they do at present. So just to recap, the problem of money, well, the problem with money is that it's trying to do two things, and those things are not entirely compatible. So money is a means of exchange. It works best when it flows through the economy, allows people to produce wealth and to exchange wealth, and it just makes things more efficient because people don't have to constantly find things that they need to swap with one another. So money flows through the economy and it helps people to generate wealth. And actually in the modern economy, it's pretty much impossible to generate any wealth at all if you don't have access to money as an input. So money is flowing when it's most useful. But the other thing that money does is it operates as a store of wealth. And when money is stored, it's not flowing. And the more money that's stored, the less money that's flowing, the bigger problem we have. So that's the problem with money. It's doing these two things and it can't make up its mind, which is most useful because one creates wealth and one allows wealth to be stored. And some people want to store wealth and some people want to create wealth for themselves, and those two things are in conflict. So that's money. What's the problem with government? Well, the problem with government is that it tends to look at things from the top down. Governments are very much focused on averages, they're focused on generalizations, they're focused upon things like stock market indices. How well is the stock market doing? How well are house prices doing? Are they up or down? Do people feel more confident or less confident in general? How wealthy are we as a nation in its entirety? How big is our GDP? These are all big picture numbers. And as I say, they represent a sort of aerial view of the economy. We're looking at things in the round in general. And what we're not doing, and what government is not doing, or is very bad at doing anyway, is looking at individual people's experience of the economy. Because after all, the UK is still the 6th largest economy in the world. And we're not a huge country in terms of population, so that means we ought to be pretty rich. And of course, some people are, but some people are desperately poor. In fact, many people are desperately poor. Millions of children are below the poverty line, millions of families are really struggling, and that's because, of course, the money is not evenly distributed. So people's experience of this wealthy economy is that they are not wealthy at all. So the government isn't really looking at that. I mean, it sort of is and sort of isn't. It would like to fix those sort of problems, but the language and the methodology and the systems it has all relate to the economy in total. And that has some pretty disastrous effects. And we can see that by looking at this image here, which is all about the distribution of wealth in the UK economy. And what we've got in blue on this side of the table, and these are the plates which people are sitting down to, this is the distribution of wealth, which is money wealth, obviously, in the economy, by percentage. So this is the richest 10% here, and this is the poorest 10% here, and that's what we've got in between. So of course, if you take an average and say, well, actually on average we're doing pretty well, because the average actually is about here. It's just below the third richest bunch of people. So on average we're all this rich, believe it or not. But the average is pretty useless because this lump here is so enormous. This plate here is so big, there's not even room for it on the table. And that means that this plate here is absolutely minute, and all these ones here are much, much smaller than they could otherwise be because this one here is so big. Now, if we take this plate here and we reduce it to the size of the second largest plate, which is this one, well, then we get the effect we've got here in green. So on this side of the table, the place settings are much, much neater. So all we've done is we've taken this biggest plate and we've reduced it to the size of the second biggest plate. And then we've taken the excess, we've taken what's left over, and we've distributed it across all the others in even terms. So they've each got some of it. Even the third biggest plate has got some of it. So the third biggest plate there is bigger than the third biggest plate here. But what's noticeable is that the plates further down the table are significantly larger than they are here. So what we've got here is a broadly and more sort of even and more acceptable, if you like, distribution of wealth across the economy. It's not the same for everybody, as you wouldn't expect that to be, but it is sort of manageable. Everybody's got something, and even these people here, the least wealthy people, have still got a significant amount. So that just gives you a picture of how challenging it is to deal with money in an economy that is so wealthy, because it's incredibly hard. It would be incredibly hard for the government to actually shift the wealth from here into the hands of the other 90%. We've talked endlessly about wealth taxes and how that could contribute, but the trouble is that a wealth tax is only going to make a tiny, tiny dent in this. So the impacts down here will be fairly small. That's not to say a wealth tax is necessarily a bad idea. There's lots of good things you could do with the 20 or 30 billion pounds you might get from a wealth tax, but they're not going to significantly impact on this. They're not going to turn this into this, by no means. The amount you'd need to take from here to achieve this is absolutely stonking. It's a huge amount, and that's not going to very easily happen. But nonetheless, it does show pretty clearly what the problem is. And this is a consequence of the government not being focused on the individual, not worrying particularly about what's happening down here, because they're interested in the average. They're interested in what's happening on average, and the average is pretty good. So how did we get here? How did we get into a situation where we have wealth which is so unequally distributed? Is it just a natural order of things? Is it just the way things are in an economy? Or is it a consequence of policy, other things that we could have done differently that would have had a different outcome? Well, the answer to that, partly at least, is to be found in this image here, which we looked at quite a few times. And this image is a picture of the UK economy, from agriculture on the left there, through manufacturing and construction and energy and things like hotels and restaurants, and then there's education and health. And then we've got government, and then we've got the retail and wholesale supply chain, and then we've got, look at this, we've got financial and business services. And then finally at the end we've got rents and property. Now the point about this is that this is where all the wealth is concentrated. This is how these people are getting so rich. And that's a consequence of the way the economy is structured. There were huge changes in the UK economy coming out of the reforms of the 1980s, and this is the result. Prior to 1980, going back certainly to the 1950s and 60s, this section here would be much, much smaller, as we've seen in one of our other images in previous videos. So this is really the reason why this is the way it is. And this is a consequence of government policy, because government thinks that this sort of activity is just as valid in economic terms as this sort of activity, when what in fact is happening is that this is creating things that we want and need, like food and products and services like, I don't know, haircuts and restaurants and hotels, and education and health, of course, and all sorts of things down here that we want and need that are really useful, that improve the quality of our life. And up here, all we're doing is we're sort of turning over money, we're extracting money from the economy and making people who've already got money even richer. And that's why, as I say, we get this concentration of wealth, because gradually the money flows from these activities down here, it's extracted from here, and it flows into here. And that's why we talk about this wealth, if you like, this activity, this wealth generating activity being a sort of tax on the productive activity that's going on here. We've talked about that in a recent video. So how's that come about? Well, that's a consequence of this top-down view that we're talking about. If the government is only interested in the generality of wealth, that is to say how wealthy we are in total, then it's obviously going to favour this sort of activity, because as you can see, it generates so-called wealth very quickly. If the government's interested in taxing wealth, for example, then it's certainly going to favour this sort of activity. And we can see that with this image down here, because this massive great pink box that we've got, that is the amount of tax that financial services people pay. And here are the number of people employed in financial services in blue. The amount of tax they're paying here is absolutely enormous relative to the amount of tax, for example, that people in manufacturing industry are paying, which you can see here. So looking at this image, the government is always going to say, let's have more of this, let's have more financial services, because look at all the tax we can get from them. And so it's going to say, we favour this sort of activity up here because we can tax it more and because it boosts GDP in a very sort of simple way, even though the effect of it is to deprive this part of the economy of the money that it needs to function most effectively. So that's roughly what's going on. Since the 1980s, the UK has moved significantly from a productive economy, a manufacturing economy, an industrial economy, into a financial economy. And because financial activity has been measured as if it is productive, it's been measured as part of GDP, we're living under the illusion that we're creating wealth when in fact we're transferring wealth from one part of the economy to the other, and the movement of wealth is being measured as genuine productive activity when of course movement doesn't create anything new, it just shifts wealth from one place to another. Now this approach, these policies that have been in place since the 1980s, this change in approach, this change in the structure of the UK economy has significant consequences. And we can see that when we look at these images over here. There's a set of three of them, we'll take them one by one. So what we've got here is the balance of payments. Now this is a fancy term for what effectively means our imports and our exports. So this is how the UK is trading with the rest of the world. And up until about the mid-1980s, we were just about all right. This is the line here that represents the mid-1980s, and above that, since about 1950 till then, the UK economy was in the black, trading with the rest of the world. We were exporting a little bit more than we were importing. And since then, since the late 1980s, it's just been a flood of red ink. And some of you will have seen this image before. It's showing that we're basically importing far more than we're exporting, and how we have to pay for that somehow, as we've previously discussed. So looking at the other images, how are we paying for it? Well, there are a number of ways we're paying for it, but these two in particular are quite significant. This one, this image here, which actually was created at Christmas, which explains to some extent the arrangement of it. These sort of Christmas presents, if you like, what they show is the ownership of UK stock markets. And what we've got on the left there is the situation around about 1980, and what the three sections are. So this is the amount of the UK stock markets that were owned by pension and insurance funds on the left. And then in blue, we've got the amount of the UK stock market in the 1980, which was owned by private individuals, effectively, or that sort of thing. And then here, the little label, that is the amount of the UK stock market in the 1980s that was owned by foreigners. And then, lo and behold, round about now, we've got a situation which is radically different. So the amount owned by UK pension and insurance funds is now absolutely tiny. And the amount owned by private individuals in the UK has shrunk significantly, and the amount owned by foreigners has increased vastly. So what's that about? Well, what that means is that the UK economy, the UK's manufacturing, the UK's industrial activity has been sold wholesale to foreign owners. And that's because here we are importing far more than we are exporting. And so we have to pay for those imports somehow, and we pay for them by selling our companies. We pay for them by selling our assets, our companies, our property, selling everything fundamentally that's not nailed down. And that's why, for example, so many of our utilities, water, electricity, and other companies of that sort are now foreign owned. And that has consequences too, because what happens when you sell an asset such as a company to a foreign owner is that they not only put money into the UK economy in the short term, but they also take money out of the UK economy. And over time, they will take more money out in profits and dividends than they ever put in. And so that means, of course, that in the end, you have to sell something else in order to pay those profits and dividends out. It's basically a cycle of wealth flowing out of the country into the hands of foreign investors, because that's why they make their investments in the first place. They invest in order to accumulate more money. So this is a sort of situation that can only get worse. The more we sell our productive assets to foreigners in order to pay for the fact that we're importing so much more than we're exporting, the more we're going to have to sell further down the line in order to pay for the fact that they're now taking away the profits. And this is a direct consequence, actually, of what's going on here. Because the reason we're having to do this is because we're not producing enough stuff. We're importing far more than we're exporting because the economy is not a productive economy. It's not an economy producing stuff. It's an economy which is turning over money. and turning over money we can't live off. We have to import stuff in order to live, and this is just not doing enough so that we can't make what we need. And as I say, we end up importing it, and that's what's produced this effect here. So the whole thing is a cycle of decline. Fundamentally, we don't make what we need in terms of our own wealth, and so we end up importing it, we end up having to pay for it, and that means we have to sell our assets, and that means that we have to put more money ultimately into the hands of foreign owners, and that means we have less for ourselves, and that's why fundamentally we get poorer. And a small number of people are able to profit from this process, bringing us back here, and the rest of us just have to put up with it, and we're going to end up poorer as a consequence. And the government is supposed to be managing this situation, but it's not doing so for the reasons we initially said, which is it's looking at the generality. So the government is saying, oh, the financial services industries, which are in here, they are the crown jewels of the UK economy. They're really, really important. We want more of the tax that they're paying, which is over here, despite the fact that actually it's the manufacturing industry here which is actually driving the economy forward. And this is just a cost onto the economy. So all this tax, well, that's just froth, if you like. That's just money which is coming out of the economy, out of the productive economy, and it's going to the hands of these people who are engaging in these sort of financial transactions, and they're taking a good chunk and they're giving some of it back in tax. They're not giving all of it back, so they're still extracting more, and of course, as I say, more and more of it is going abroad too. So if the government wants to fix this problem, well, it's just got to change the way it thinks about money. It's got to stop thinking about money as a store of wealth, and to think the more we can think about ourselves as being wealthy, the more we can imagine wealth being held by these people here, or wealth being held in house prices going up, or stock market indices going up, whatever it might be. As long as we think about wealth in those terms, we're not going to make progress. But if we think about wealth, about money and wealth as being united in a process which individual people can take part in other words, if you put money into the hands of individual people, they can use that to create real wealth in their lives. If you think about that, if you think about money in terms of its turnover, its flow, think about money as something which makes wealth creation happen, then you get a completely different output. And for that to happen, the government has got to be willing and able and brave enough to put money into the economy in different ways. And that's when we come to the final image in this series here, which is this one here. Now this one is all about government borrowing. Now we know the government is terrified of borrowing too much. The government doesn't like to think that it's in debt to the bond markets, for example. But actually that's pretty absurd, because the government creates all the money in the UK economy. It all comes from the government. It all comes from the Bank of England. And who owns the Bank of England? Well, the government owns the Bank of England. So all the money in the UK economy has come from the government. And its debt to the Bank of England is therefore completely nominal. If the government is putting money into the economy and creating debt by doing so for itself, then it's creating an asset for other people in the economy, because that's how it works. The so-called debt the government has to the Bank of England is balanced out by an asset which is owned by the people in the economy who can own things, such as houses or industries or whatever it might be. So it doesn't actually make sense for the government not to be willing to put into the economy the money that is needed to allow it to flow. And if we look here what we've got, well, what we've actually got is the box here, the empty box, interestingly enough, is the money that currently the government is borrowing from the Bank of England. And the reason why it's empty is it's really completely notional borrowing. It's not actual borrowing at all. It doesn't have to pay it back. It doesn't have to pay interest on it. It's just borrowing the money from itself, fundamentally. So it's an accounting thing. It's designed to make us feel terrible, if you like, we're borrowing all this money. But in fact, it doesn't really matter at all. And then over here, we've got other sorts of borrowing. In other words, these are the government's gilts or bonds that they sell to create borrowing. And what we've got actually is here borrowing owned by UK pension and insurance funds. So that's investments in people's lives, if you like, pensions and that sort of thing. People's insurance policies are backed by this. And then here we've got gilts, bonds owned by the banks, the UK banks, just to give them a bit of security, give them a sort of buffer. And then up here, we've got bonds, UK gilts, UK borrowing owned by things like hedge funds and private investors and people who are just out to make a bit more money with the money they've already got. And then finally, what we've got here in red, well, that is all the UK borrowing that is foreign owned. In other words, that's borrowing from foreigners. And that's, again, something where the government is paying out good money, good interest, in order to borrow money from abroad in order to help balance out this situation we've got here where we are importing far more than we're exporting, and somehow we have to get money into the UK economy to compensate for that. So what can we learn from this image here? Well, I suppose the first question to ask is, what do we mean by government bonds? What are government bonds? What are gilt bonds? Well, the answer is that they are effectively a sort of taxation for rich people. Because the way this works is that the government has to make sure it doesn't put too much money into the economy. The government controls the money supply into the economy, and if it puts too much money into the economy, then that will create inflation because there'll be more money chasing not enough stuff and prices will go up. So government controls the money supply, and one way it does that is through borrowing, because by borrowing money, it effectively takes money out of the economy. It takes money away from people and says, we'll hold on to that money and we'll pay you interest to do so. And I call it taxation for rich people because these people are being paid interest on the money that's being taken away from them, which is very different to the situation of you and me. When we pay our tax, we're never going to see it again. These people who are buying UK bonds, they're effectively paying a sort of tax which they're going to get back with interest at some point in the future. But the purpose is the same. The purpose of tax and the purpose of selling bonds is the same. It's to take money out of the economy to ensure that the amount of money in the economy is not so much as to cause inflation. It's designed to balance the economy out. So that's why the government is doing this. It makes sense in many ways to sell bonds into parts of the UK economy, such as, for example, pension funds and banks, because that creates stability in the economy for these UK institutions. It provides them with a guaranteed source of income which they can pass on to their customers, and so the UK economy may be stronger as a consequence of that. But the other two boxes, the blue one and the red one, well, they've got nothing to do with the internal strength of the UK economy. They have to do with the fact that the government needs to support the UK currency. And if the pound is losing value on the foreign exchange markets, then this situation is likely to get worse because in effect we have to pay more, even more for our imports. And so the government has to somehow create confidence in the UK economy, in the UK market. And one way that it does that is by effectively paying people abroad to hold pounds, to buy UK bonds. So let's go back to our question. What happens when the problem of money coincides with the problem of government? And what we can see is that the economy becomes fundamentally much less productive, because the problem of government is that it doesn't see how productivity, how production operates at an individual level, how individual people can, given the opportunity, create wealth in their lives. It doesn't focus upon that. It only focuses upon the big picture. And the problem of money is, of course, that more and more of it ends up in store and less of it is allowed to flow through the economy. And for all these reasons we've talked about, the government is not willing or able or willing to consider even putting more money into the economy, having more money flow through the economy, and try to have less money being stored up in people's hands who have plenty already. As we can see, for example, here with these foreign investors, or here with these people who have far more wealth than anybody else. Or indeed here, where the UK stock market is now largely foreign owned. So these are all concentrations of money. These are all ways in which money is being concentrated in the hands of relatively small numbers of wealthy people and is not available to flow through the rest of the economy. And that means we're not producing enough wealth, and that's given us this situation here, and it's given us this situation here where people simply don't have enough to live on in many cases, and they certainly don't have enough to produce the wealth in their own lives that would go some way to alleviating their situations. So what's the answer to our question? What does happen when the problem of money comes up against the problem of government? And we're beginning to see the answer through these images, because what we can say is that the government's overview of the economy, the way the government is looking at the economy from the top down, is preventing it from seeing how the economy works from an individual perspective, and is using money as a tool simply to create more stored wealth in situations like this, and like this, and like this, and like this, because that's what it's easy to do, and because in the numbers that looks quite impressive. That sort of builds reassurance around how the economy works. We said that the UK is still the 6th largest economy in the world. Well, that's only true because we measure these financial transactions here as being economic activity. Without them, the economy would be far, far smaller. But those transactions are not creating wealth, as we say. And the government needs to rethink the way in which it approaches the creation of wealth. And that means it needs to address the problem of money, and it needs to address its own problem of looking at the economy from the top and start looking at the economy from the experience of real individual people who cannot create wealth in their own lives without access to money. Now, the actual solution to that, well, there are a number of ways forward. There's been a lot of talk recently about the universal basic income, for example. That's an extreme form of putting money into the hands of ordinary people. But there are lots of other ways. It's simply a question of not making it quite so easy for wealthy people to get wealthier. We need to change the system in the way that the economy works. We need to refocus our government policy on encouraging activity in this part. We need an industrial policy. We need a policy to produce more in the UK. We need policies around education that teach people the sort of really useful skills that will allow them to be productive. And we don't want to see all our best graduates going into financial services when they've got degrees in engineering, for example. So there's a whole load of things we could do differently. But we've got so hooked, we've got so addicted to this sort of financial activity, which is producing this outcome here, and it's producing this outcome here, and ultimately it's producing this outcome here when we say massively in the red, and that means that the foreign people are now owning so much of the UK economy because we're simply not directing our resources in the most productive way. And that's the question that the government's simply got to take on, because if not, as we said before, the situation will get worse and worse. The UK will become poorer and poorer. We will be working almost exclusively for the benefit of our foreign owners, and we will retain less and less of the product of our work for ourselves and our families. So there we are. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, do please press the like button. That really helps, and do subscribe if you haven't done already. If you want more information, well, there's a certain amount on our website, which is at bonkerseconomics.net. And finally, if you want to buy postcards of some of these images, well, they're also available. You can find them on the website too. Thanks very much.